Good afternoon, everyone. How are you all doing today? Good? Good, good. So please grab some food if you haven't. We have a lot of food in the back. There's some empty seats up front. Like I always say, it's not class. No one will call on you. So please come up front if you're looking for a seat. I'm so grateful for such a wonderful turnout today for my friend and colleague, Dean Catherine Quinlan, and really so grateful to her because I know how time-consuming the life of a dean is, and so I'm really grateful to her for being here and for spending so much time thinking about the call of the question today, what matters to me and why. I also, I hate to put you on the spot, but we have a very special guest today, a USC trustee, Dr. Bob Padgett. So, Bob, I'm really grateful to you for being here. Please join me in welcoming to What Matters to Me and Why, Dr. Padgett. And please, please come back for future events. So before we begin, I just want to shamelessly plug a few upcoming events like I always do. This is Interfaith Week on campus. So every day this week, there's some interfaith program or event. They're all free and open to the public. Today, after What Matters to Me and Why on Truesdale, we're doing a calligraphy workshop on campus. And tonight at 7 p.m. at the Crusoe Catholic Center, we're showing a film, You Are Here, and we're going to do a panel discussion with one of the actors from the film. Tomorrow is Purim. It'll be celebrated from 11 to 2 p.m. on Truesdale and also at Hillel and Chabad. And Saturday, the whole week culminates in what we call an interfaith block party. It's going to be at the Crusoe Catholic Center. It's going to have representatives of the many different student religious groups on campus, including many of the religious directors and chaplains. Also a free lunch, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Saturday at the Crusoe Catholic Center. And you can just show up anytime for that. And I really encourage you to attend. Tomorrow night at 7 p.m., we're doing an event for our Spirituality and Sports initiative called Championing the Soul, the Role of Religion, Spirituality, and Faith-Based Personal Development in Sports. And the panel will include a number of athletes, Tariq Abdul-Wahad, Chris Cluey, and LaJuan Ramsey. We did an event, some of you might have been to on Friday with Kobe Bryant on Spirituality and Sports. We screened his new film, Muse, and we had a Q&A with him, and it was kind of extraordinary. And he really challenged our students to think deeply about the big questions in their life through the lens of sports, and that's what we'll be doing tomorrow. So please join us tomorrow at 7 p.m. It's at the Annenberg School, Annenberg L105A. It's the auditorium at Annenberg, and it's being co-sponsored by the Sports Media Institute at Annenberg. And there's more information on the website, orl.usc.edu. So all that being said, as you know, what makes our initiative here, which is in our 14th year, What Matters to Me and Why, so unique within the landscape of programs like this around the country is that our speakers are chosen by students and introduced by students. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity today to introduce you to one of our students. We'll introduce our speaker. He is a senior neuroscience major. He is also the chief of staff of undergraduate student government. Please join me in welcoming Hassan Ibrahim.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so honored to have been invited by Dean Soni to introduce our speaker today, Dean Catherine Quinlan. I first had the privilege of meeting Dean Quinlan about 2 years ago in the context of my work with undergraduate student government. My colleague Michael Yoshimura and I, now an alum, he and I decided to finally advocate for the plight of the 24/7 Levy Library dweller and bring the concerns of the student body to the university in regards to what could be done about renovating Levy Library. When we first walked into Dean Quinlan's office those 2 years ago, her beautiful office on the first floor with a great view of Alumni Park, I wasn't sure what to expect. In my mind, maybe partially based off of my affinity for Harry Potter, I thought maybe she'd be something, and also in addition to, you know, studying Hoos Library and the Hoos Library in the Mud Hall of Philosophy a lot, I kind of expected the Dean of Libraries to be somewhat like Dumbledore. You know, wise, kind, and steeped in tradition. While Dean Quinlan certainly does not have that massive facial hair, which I'm slowly working towards, of Dumbledore, she is certainly the epitome of wisdom and kindness. However, what inspired me most about that first conversation with Dean Quinlan was her desire to not be held back by traditions, in particular traditional thinking. Talking to Dean Quinlan lights a fire in the imagination about what is possible on our campus. On the topic of Levy Library, Dean Quinlan was so encouraging to my colleague and I about beginning a campaign for its renovation. In fact, at our very first meeting, we even talked about her plans to eventually build a new state-of-the-art facility that would house the hundreds and thousands of academic resources our university has. The forward thinking that Dean Quinlan so passionately embodies has helped propel the university forward in countless ways. With Dean Quinlan's help in allowing the student government to amplify the voices of our student body to the provost and president's office, the basement and first floor of Levy Library were successfully renovated last summer, and we're on track to hopefully have the entire building complete in the near future. Dean Quinlan also administers the Sidney Harmon Academy of Polymathic Study at USC, which is a group dedicated to promoting conversations to enhance the integrated interdisciplinary approach to the issues of a global world. In the 8 years that Dean Quinlan has been at USC, she has worked to establish the model for a 21st century library and has established partnerships across the university, the city, the nation, and even the world to solidify this. Dean Quinlan continues to work to come up with exciting ways to engage students with the libraries, and her strong belief in the necessity of our libraries to meet the students of our university is so refreshing. Dean Quinlan is also so much more than the purveyor of the 23 libraries on this campus. She's an avid cello player who is overly protective of her cellos. In fact, she refuses to actually check them in on airplanes and will lug them into the overhead baggage compartments on airplanes. She hails from our friendly neighbor country up north, where she received her MBA from the Memorial University of Newfoundland, a Master of Library Studies degree from Dalhousie University, and a Bachelor of Music degree from Queen's University. It has been my honor to work with Dean Quinlan these past 2 years, and I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to learn and be inspired by her. Without further ado, please welcome Dean Catherine Quinlan.
Thank you, Hassan. It's always weird being introduced because you have this sort of weird out-of-body experience as you hear yourself described. And I'm not sure about that whole Dumbledore thing, but I like the wise and kind, so, 2 out of 3. So thank you again, Hassan, and thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon. As I say to many groups to whom I speak, that as Hassan mentioned, I'm from Newfoundland, and we're known for many things, one of which is you talk really, really quickly. So John Juracek, you're in charge of flagging me down if I start to talk very, very quickly. Opportunities like this, which really give you the time to reflect without sort of the urgency of a huge looming deadline or the burden of some kind of meeting agenda, are rare and really invaluable. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Dean Soni, for this wonderful opportunity that he's provided to me, and I think it's a great service to our academic and creative communities on this campus. So thanks, Varun. I like really that this series happens in this place because it really is a combination laboratory, sanctuary for musicians, spoken word poets, and improv comedians. It's a space for performance, and that's important to what I want to talk about today. A number of people, when they found out that I'd been invited to this, said, "Oh, we're so looking forward to hearing you talk about the library." And I said, well, I'm not going to talk about the library. I'm going to talk about what matters to me and why. So as a performance space, I think it was kind of also interesting that in my official capacity as Dean of the USC Libraries, I had to get used to my first 2 years here to being called Dean Quinlan. I kept saying, my name's Catherine, and they said, yes, Dean. So, Dean Quinlan. But as Dean of your libraries, I do get to perform. I get to juggle multiple priorities. I get to create new programs. And my past experience as a stand-up comic at Caroline's actually stands me in good stead on many, many occasions. But earlier in my life, I was more of a performer in the performing arts sense of performance. As Hassan mentioned, I studied the cello. In fact, I studied it very, very seriously for a number of years, in fact, decades. My first degree was in music, my second degree was music, and my third degree was in music. And I still play. And that act has remained consistently important to me. Through studying with many different teachers around the world, playing with a wide variety of orchestras and other groups, I have the wonderful privilege of having played My Fair Lady 362 times in the pit. I practiced consistently through my 10 days of law school, that's another story, 2 years at library school, and more than 5 years completing my MBA part-time. And through all the career and life experiences that brought me eventually from Newfoundland, Canada, to this wonderful part of California and USC, my cello has really been important to me. So when Dean Soni invited me to participate in What Matters to Me and Why, I knew that I'd find the core of what I'd want to discuss somewhere within that realm of performance. But trying to identify a single most important moment in time or one formative experience that shaped what I value, that really is the challenge of preparing these kinds of remarks. So I'm going to start with a story. I like stories. My mother was British and a musician. My father Polish and an atomic research physicist. And that combination, as you can probably imagine, made for a rather rigorous approach in our family to learning and culture. When you were 4 years old, you were invited to sit at the adult table for dinner. And while you really looked forward to that moment, you also knew that you were going to be required to do long division in your head and explain sort of the convex and concave properties of a spoon. So it was a little formidable. But part of that rigorous approach was also part of our introduction to learning and culture, and music was, of course, an important part of that as well. So while in retrospect I appreciated all of that rigor, as a child it wasn't exactly one of my favorite things. We had a tradition in our home. Each child, and there are many of us, not as many as my sister-in-law, she's one of 18. Each child started playing piano at the age of 3. When you turned 6 years old, you were invited into my father's den to talk with my parents and to make a very important decision. Now, his den had this air of seriousness and studiousness about it, and it really embodied the accomplishments and therefore the expectations of my parents. And I appreciated that even as a child, but I also understood that serious and studious meant, well, it meant work. And again, not really a 6-year-old's idea of fun. So the choice before me, as I sat there in that serious room with its many, many papers and its many, many books, was to select the stringed instrument that I would learn how to play. This is a choice all of my siblings and I were asked to make, and from that point on, growing proficient in that instrument would become a large part of our childhood, and for many of us would continue on. So like any imaginative child, unburdened by practicalities, and I knew this conversation was coming because I have 2 older sisters, I thought, I gotta be prepared for this conversation. What stringed instrument am I gonna pick? So I thought, I'm going to pick the harp. And why wouldn't you want to play the harp? They're big, they're stately, angels play them. How can you not want to play the harp? My father, though, had been through this with my 2 older sisters, and he was more aware of the practicalities than I, one of which was the weight of the harp. It weighs about 80 pounds. He said to me, Catherine, who's going to carry the harp? I looked at him and said, well, you're going to carry the harp. And he looked at me and said, but you know, I travel a lot. He was away a lot giving papers at various conferences. And he said, who's going to carry the harp then? And I turned to my mother and I said, you'll carry the harp. And that was not the right answer. So I had to choose again. So I knew I didn't want to play the violin. My 2 older sisters played the violin, and listening to them practice was not a pleasant experience. My mother played the cello, and I resembled her quite a bit. So my parents put on the full court press and decided that it was really logical that I play the cello too. I was not that convinced about that whole you look like your mother, therefore you should be like your mother argument. But my father, being the practical man that he is, pointed out to me that unlike my sisters who play the violin, if I picked the cello, I could practice sitting down. So I thought, all right, I'll play the cello, and that began my lifelong commitment to the cello. And I say commitment purposefully, because practicing the cello wasn't just a thing that I did. I quickly figured out that sitting down didn't make it any easier to learn. But I also began to realize that the art of practice held great value in and of itself. I grew to embrace the patience, persistence, and vulnerability that practice requires. We're all practicing something in one way or another all the time. But why? Typically because we're intent on an outcome. We feel the heavy expectations of ourselves and of others, expectations that our practice will deliver something of value, something of beauty, or something of use. Such intensity of focus on the end result, as if the intermediate steps offer no value of their own, is in my mind a sort of intellectual and emotional tyranny. I see this daily in our libraries, in the form of anxious students, worried students, students in the throes of full-on metaphysical distress. I'm no more immune to that distress than any of you, but I have discovered that when I think about work or education or even relationships as a kind of perpetual practice, it can be a kind of a remarkably calming thought, and perhaps paradoxically, a wonderfully productive way of being. Persistence and patience have their place in all of that, but it's the state of vulnerability that has been and remains most important to me. Whatever system of work and reward we're talking about, career and money, school and grades, attention and celebrity, no one likes to admit feeling vulnerable. Our culture classifies vulnerability as a weakness at best and failure at worst. On career fair days, I don't see too many employees on Truesdale Parkway recruiting vulnerable accountants or vulnerable computer programmers. And that, to me, really is a shame. To discourage vulnerability in an intellectual environment like ours is to inhibit the most basic act upon which all of our development depends, the exchange of ideas. Self-discovery and discovery of the world do not happen without people challenging your ideas and telling you that you're wrong. And that's not something to fear. That's an essential step in learning, and it requires a deep and abiding comfort with a state of vulnerability. Now, I've said that I view my relationship with the art of practice as a commitment, and commitments, if they're authentic, have consequences. So I want to share an example of how I've tried to enact in my work here at USC, how that commitment informs my perspective on what we all do together in our intellectual community, and why practice, persistence, patience, and vulnerability matter to me so very much. So I got this thing here up with me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that thing is and why, to me, it was an embodiment of what matters to me. So we mounted a large participatory project at the libraries a couple of years ago. It depended entirely upon hundreds of participants embracing the art of practice, exhibiting patience, being vulnerable, and persevering, even though none of us really knew how or even if the project would arrive at a successful conclusion. I started a program called the USC Libraries Discovery Fellowship, and our first fellow, I think a number of you met her, was a science writer and curator named Margaret Wertheim. My charge to Margaret, as the library's very first Discovery Fellow, was to dramatize the acts of discovery and creation among our community at USC, to show the library as something more than a repository for knowledge, to show the library as a place of invention, as an active partner in the production of new knowledge and works of art. So a simple business card was the foundation of the resulting project. And that's it on the screen, a standard-sized business card. The pattern that you see is from our collections, an illustration in a 19th century edition of Elements by the classical mathematician Euclid. We got together with an MIT engineer and origami artist named Janine Mosley, who had developed a method for building three-dimensional models of fractals. If you're not familiar with fractals, and I sure wasn't before this project started, they're essentially endless patterns created by repeating a step or a set of steps over and over. Mathematicians call them self-similar because the tiniest element of a fractal is structurally identical to the next largest, which is identical to the next largest, and so on and so on. So there may be another picture. Yes, there is. So that is a two-dimensional drawing of a fractal, often referred to as a snowflake fractal, and you can see why they call it a snowflake fractal. So our project was to build a massive three-dimensional version of that flat object. Our plan was to use the simple origami techniques to create something remarkably complex, something that no one had ever brought into being on such a scale. The project, when it was done, would require 49,000 of those business cards. 49,000 business cards. Already you can see that this had the potential to overwhelm and to go horribly, horribly wrong. But therein, I think, lay the beauty of the business card method. It depends entirely on making two precise, well-practiced folds on each business card. In fact, Margaret and Janine often reminded us throughout the process that the folding was the linchpin of the construction. If our folds were no good, the fractal would collapse. So the only thing that would hold the fractal together was the origami techniques used in folding the business cards. So we practiced, and we practiced, and we practiced some more. We admitted we didn't know how to do this, and we learned as a group. And through the art of practice, the enormity of the project, in fact, subsided. The pleasures of patience and persistence came to the fore. In the end, more than 300 USC students, K-12 students from nearby schools, and just people who enjoyed the tactile work, helped build a beautiful mathematical art object. Some were invested in the math, and some cared most about the art. But again and again, they told us that the art of practicing the folding technique is what drew them into the project. And for a little perspective, each card needed 2 folds. So at 49,000 cards, that's 98,000 folds. We couldn't use about 25% of those cards because the creases weren't perpendicular or crisp enough. After all, we were practicing. That meant we needed another 12,250 cards and 24,500 folds to arrive at the number of cards in the final object. So all told, we made 122,500 folds in 61,250 business cards. We accomplished that by practicing an incredibly simple, repetitive technique. Several hundred people, all practicing, persevered, and with patience, created this. The finished product was about 175 pounds of business cards, shaped into a 6-foot by 6-foot sculpture, inspired by our library's collections, built by our community. We have a small sample of it right here that you're more than welcome to come and look. It's, I've been told, 5.5% of the finished product, which is about 1/18, so 18 more of those. It really was an object of wonder. We learned from our Discovery Fellow that a fractal, in mathematical terms, exists as a concept. It's infinite. It just keeps going, repeating the cycle and getting ever larger. All we could do was decide when to stop building so that we'd have a cohesive unit, one that sufficiently illustrated the self-similar properties of the fractal. Although we finished the project, we in no way completed the fractal itself. We just stopped at a point determined by the limits of human labor and the reality of having to fit it in the lobby of Doheny Library. And so Bill could carry it. So from a math perspective, the project was infinite. We never really had a shot at completing it. And in that sense, the project was nothing but practice. That project illustrates another important aspect of the art of practice. It makes it less daunting to act on your inspirations and embark upon massive projects. It lowers the barriers to participation without diminishing the import of the endeavor. Now, our fractal got some press, including an article in the New York Times. And several months later, out of the blue, a math teacher sent us photos of a fractal just as big as ours that he and his school children had built in Madagascar, using only our folding instructions that he'd found online. And that's all it took for him and his students to recreate and reinterpret what we had done at USC. So I view the fractal as a tangible manifestation of the place vulnerability holds in my work here as a librarian and library leader. I approach every day as practice for the next, and that means I expect and try hard to be comfortable with criticism. I'm prepared for setbacks as much as for achievements, for brilliant successes as much as outright failures, because that's what practice is. That's what it was for me sitting there practicing my cello, and that's what it still is for me as dean of our libraries. Libraries are the only institutions on the planet whose job it is to carry forward the intellectual continuity of humanity. Google doesn't do that. Art museums don't do that, at least not with the breadth and scope of libraries, and no single school or department at this university does, just our libraries. That is the unique burden and singular beauty of libraries. Perpetuating the intellectual continuity of humanity. That's a big job. It's like the mathematical ideal of the fractal. It's infinite. That job will never be done. The intellectual record will never be complete. But it matters to me tremendously that I do my part. And so every day, I practice getting better at managing a library. A book called The Inventor's Dilemma has been all over the bestseller lists. It's by a Harvard professor and management expert named Clayton Christensen. He talks about management as a noble profession. I'm sure you're as surprised to hear that as I was to read it. He thinks it's a noble profession because it's a unique pursuit that's so fulfilling, because as a manager, your job is to help others learn, take responsibility, and earn recognition for what they achieve. Seriously pursuing the art of practice is how I work every day toward that noble goal of supporting our intellectual community. In closing, I'd like to quote another well-known management expert, Jedi Master Yoda. Now you remember, I know this is going to date me, but I think they're coming back, but you remember in The Empire Strikes Back, when Luke Skywalker must use the Force to raise his ship out of the swamp. Luke's not so confident in his Force powers, but he says he'll give it a try. And Yoda replies, "Do or not. There is no try." Now, you see, I think that's pretty bad advice. And if that's the quality of wisdom Yoda's handing out, maybe that's why Darth Vader keeps coming back. If I were to condense my commitment to the art of practice, my belief in the essential worth of patience and vulnerability, into the parlance of Star Wars, I'd say the precise opposite. There is only try. So with much love and gratefulness to my parents for helping set me on this path when I started practicing how to learn the piano when I was 3 years old, and with all apologies and due respect to Master Yoda, I thank you for coming, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Testing.
Uh-oh.
If you'll raise your hand, I'll bring you a microphone. Question?
Well, Catherine, thank you so much. I learned so much about you that I surmised but didn't really know for a fact. Now I'm more informed. My question is a fairly simple one. It has to do with your perception of USC before you arrived here and how it changed during the time you've been here.
Bob Paget never asked simple questions, but yeah, thanks for telling everybody it's simple. My perception of USC was an institution that, as a private institution, was very focused on achievement, on being the best in everything, and it never really looked like it failed. And since being here, I've realized that really what USC is all about is innovation. And I remember Steve Sample was president when I was hired, and I had this wonderful conversation with him when he said to me that he expected every dean, and in fact every person who works at USC, to be innovative and to try things. And he said, obviously you can't do anything illegal. He said, you have to stay this side of the law. He said, not this side of the law, but this side of the law. And he said, if I wasn't getting a good, solid B- every year, I wasn't trying hard enough. And he said, if you only try the things that you think are going to succeed, you're missing a lot of opportunity. So for me, being at USC has given me opportunities to investigate all kinds of things. I know that when Max was provost, I drove him crazy. Hassan mentioned this library that I've been trying to build for 7 years. Still isn't built, but we keep trying. So to me, USC is about a place of opportunity and a place that encourages trying. God, I've struck you dumb. That's amazing.
What do you think about the so-called overachievers who always try their best to reach a perfect result? Do you think it's an attitude worth learning from them, or do you think they try too hard?
I don't think trying too hard is ever bad. I think when it overtakes your life. I mean, I used to teach the cello, and I would see a number of parents, mothers usually, but fathers too, who would get so involved in the process of their child learning that they would push them to a point that any joy left in the process of learning was just eradicated. So when I look at overachievers, if they're still enjoying what they do, if they still find comfort and value in what they're doing, when it gets to the point where they're sort of bludgeoned into learning because there's a requirement or an expectation that maybe they don't share, to me that's really sad, because I think you lose the fun of what life is all about, and you lose the opportunity to really explore. I think when you're focused on one particular outcome, it makes it really difficult to see what's around you.
Yeah, just one more question. Do
Sure.
you believe there is a state of perfect?
No.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question about your view on libraries. You said a new library. I find that libraries have often, the ones that are truly loved by students, are usually a sanctuary for them.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they have to work, people tend to like the older traditional styles because for some reason I think it reminds them of a sanctuary. How do you fit that in with some of the newer things? So you see some newer libraries, they have a lot of steel and metal, kind of a different feel. How do you kind of put those two together into kind of a new library that meets the needs of people, but also still maintains that sanctuary quality?
I've been really lucky that over the last 20 years, I've been involved in building a lot of libraries. I got involved when Hong Kong moved their undergraduate program from 3 to 4 year, and they redid every library in Hong Kong, which was something like 55 libraries. And I was part of each project. And the interesting thing for us, every university had a different form. It was built by a different architectural firm. But what was important to us as we thought about libraries was to think about people and to think about how people occupy the space and how space really informs how you feel. So even though some of the libraries were very, very modern and some were more like Hoos Library if you go to Mudd Hall, we felt that we had been successful because when we went back to see how people were using the space, they'd been able to adapt that space in a way that allowed them to collaborate and to work together. So I think it doesn't really matter so much, you know, whether the walls are black or the ceiling is high or low. It's how you design the space so that people feel that they can inhabit the space and make it their own. And as you know, we're doing that with the graduate students as we look at Levy Library this summer.
Thank you.
Oh, a brave library faculty member is going to ask a question.
I'm always intrigued in these talks when people talk about their innermost beliefs. So do you consider yourself a religious person?
I don't know. What do you mean by religion?
Well, you know, it's being conflated with spiritual or, you know, just some kind of sense of, you know, the biggest picture.
I certainly think there's a bigger element than I am. I think that there's a part of the world that we know nothing about, and I think I take comfort in that. So I don't know if that makes me a religious person. My father was Jewish and my mother was Roman Catholic, so she converted when they got married, and we were raised as Jews until I was like 8 years old, and I think my father had some massive conflict or something because we all got marched down to the local Catholic church and got baptized. So I've always been a little confused about what it means to be religious, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about things that are... in fact, when Dean Stoney invited me to give this talk, I told him that I was going to talk about nothing. And he said, "Oh, Michael Quick's already done that." And I said, "No. I mean the spirit of nothingness. You know, the fact that we really all are nothing in the sense, I think, of what you're talking about, Claude. But I thought that might just be, I could see the headline in the Daily Trojan, USC Dean of Libraries believes in nothing. So I thought I'd leave that to the true Buddhists among us. We'll leave that to you, Dean Stoney."
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, as somebody who spends a lot of time trying to get students to relate to each other, I've been thinking about libraries used to be places where, because that was the only place you could get the information, they were places of communal gathering. And I'm just curious, your career spanned the internet era, and it may be too broad a question, but I'm just wondering, how do you see the internet changing not just the role of libraries, but the way in which relationships and information go together?
Yeah, I don't think the internet's really changed our role because we've had to deal with different media throughout the time of libraries. I mean, from Babylonian clay tablets to papyrus to, you know, the advent of print to so the internet for us was just one more iteration of that process. My staff, in fact, they've tried so hard to teach me to say process, and I just can't do it, so it's process. So the constant throughout all of those changes has been that people generally don't know how to find the information they need. So when printing started, or when, you know, illuminated manuscripts were done by the church, I mean, they were kept in monasteries, and people couldn't go in without getting, you know, permission, and then they couldn't find it because it was stacked in a particular way. So with the internet, that in fact has made our job more complicated because people think because it's on the computer, first of all, it's true, and secondly, they think it's easy to find. But we all know that the World Wide Web is a worldwide mess in many cases. So our job here has increasingly been how to make students and faculty sort of educated consumers and critical consumers of information. I mean, I had a student at another place I worked come to me very excited that he discovered that smoking wasn't all that bad for you. The student, he smoked like a couple of packs a day, and whenever I saw him, I said, put that thing out. I know I'm not your mother, but put that thing out. He said, look, you know, it's not that bad. And I said, well, do you know who did that website? He goes, yeah, Philip Morris. You know, it's a great website. And I said, do you know who Philip Morris is? He goes, no. I said, well, they make cigarettes. So of course they'd be telling you that, you know, maybe the jury's still out on these things. So as we look at libraries as places of interaction, we try to do a lot of things around our collections to bring people in. The Harmon Academy that Hassan mentioned has, I think, been a great opportunity to see the library in a really different way. It's a way that is not just interdisciplinary, but polymathic, that it represents just about every discipline. So we try to engage students through projects like the Fractal. We also try to get out more. I've been talking with Ainsley Carey about, as they build the residential village at the old International University Village site, that there be a library presence, whether that's a library person or somebody walking around, but that we mingle more with our community. So instead of expecting everybody to come to us because we sort of held all the information, the internet has democratized that in a lot of ways, and so I think we need to be more present in the various communities as opposed to expecting everybody to come into our community.
This is kind of a shift in direction, but I was wondering what direction or what role you feel that the libraries play with, and libraries in general, with the Harmon Institute for Polymathic Study, and how you see that in the direction of the university.
I was really lucky that I got to meet Sidney Harmon. And when he came to talk with the president about establishing this academy, he was, I think, lobbied by a number of deans about, you know, it should go in this school or it should go in that school. And he came over to the library, and we had a long conversation, and we talked about the many libraries. And finally, he turned to me and said, well, in fact, you're the most polymathic place on campus. And I said, that's right. I represent everything. It's, you know, the old saying that nobody graduates from a library, but nobody graduates without a library. So he decided that his academy would become part of the library. And I think that's been useful to us as a library to really take the kind of collections, the kind of the static things that people see libraries collecting, and really enliven them by seeing the students use them through the academy. And I think as the GE program has been revised on this campus, I see the academy really playing a role there. Tara McPherson, who's the current director, she's a cinematic arts professor, has been really engaged in starting to bring the graduate students and the TAs into the academy as well. So there's more of this continuum of students and of learners that we have on this campus. And I think the academy is a good example of what we can do elsewhere on campus. So it's been really helpful for us to have that there. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for coming. I just wanted to give this brief, this little tiny little present to Dean Quinlan to thank her so much.
I thought you were returning a library book.
No, not quite. I know those don't go to you.
You're here.
It's just a brief journal. Hopefully you'll continue to chronicle what matters to you and why.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming.
I hope that didn't get your mind. Your heart is too strong.